Hello, I'm Jacqueline Morose, the Literary Festival Director. Thank you for joining us today for our Global Voices Festival. Today's talk is with two Korean American novelists. The festival benefits Succeed Together, a nonprofit based in Montclair that provides free educational services to underserved children. If you'd like to support our program, you can donate via the link in the chat. I want to thank all our volunteers and festival sponsors today, including Rayo's Homemade, Ameriprise Financial, and West of Hudson Realtors, as well as Watchung Booksellers. If you have a question for today's speakers, you can click on the Ask a Question bar on the bottom right of your screen. We are fortunate to have as our moderator today Karen Chee, a comedian and staff writer for Late Night with Seth Meyers, who is speaking to us from South Korea, where it's 5 a.m. She's working on a humor collection at the moment. You'll have to come back for that one, Karen. She'll be speaking with Frances Cha about her debut novel, If I Had Your Face. Frances is a former travel and culture editor for CNN in Seoul. She lives in Brooklyn with her family. Nancy Jooyoun Kim is the author of The Last Story of Mina, a Reese's Book Club pick and New York Times bestseller. She lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. We're thrilled to have these women here today. I'd like to add that we condemn anti-Asian bigotry and all hate crimes and discrimination wherever it takes place, and we are dedicated to supporting diversity and tolerance for all. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here.
Yay! Thank you for having us,
Jackie.
Yay! Okay. Oh my gosh. We just met in the green room, but I'm so excited to meet you officially. For everyone tuning in, thank you for being here. I'm Karen, and this is my first time meeting both Frances and Nancy. Wow, I just gave a couple names.
Francie. That is what we are.
5 in the morning. I would be, my eyes wouldn't open at that time.
It is 5 in the morning here, but I'm truly so excited to see you both. I also know she just mentioned, anti-Asian bigotry, and I just really wanted to say something at the top, which is that I know this has been a really hard week for a lot of us, and I've sort of fallen behind on a lot of work I'm supposed to do because of this, and I think that's very normal for everybody. But I will say that this event was sort of a little bright light at the end of my week, and I kept thinking about it, and I thought how if this event were anything else, I might have been like, hey, I don't know if I have the bandwidth for it, but this actually kept me going, so I'm genuinely really excited to talk with you both, and I'm so glad people are here to tune in.
Thank you.
I just want to say, Karen, I mean, thank you so much for saying what you did on Late Night with Seth Meyers. I saw that segment. It was exactly what everyone wants to hear, and you spoke for all of us when you spoke about, it was just so emotional, and I might cry tonight as well. I've just been a wreck since I heard the news, but it is really upsetting, and I'm just glad to be here as well.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, thank you. So elegant and powerful and to the point, and you delivered it with such poise and grace, and speaking for so many people who cannot speak right now just because of how much this hurts for so many people. And so just want to thank you for that also.
Thank you. I really genuinely appreciate that. I feel like, and this is a question I want to ask you guys too, but when I wrote that piece specifically, I was really thinking, the audience for a lot of network TV shows are very white, but I really wanted to make sure that, when Asian women saw it, that's who it was supposed to be for. So the fact that you felt that way means a lot to me, and I appreciate that. And obviously, anybody can cry, and that's super welcome and okay. And I'm really glad we have this space to be together. That was really special, and thank you so much. I was envisioning this talk to be more of a conversation between the three of us. But if we want to, I'm happy to start off with a few questions, or maybe if you want to talk about your book in the beginning. I'll show the audience in case you guys haven't gotten it yet. This is Frances's book. This is Nancy's book. Together, this is Francie's book.
It's kind of
both,
in the back.
We're an item now.
It's kind of, I was thinking about how like Nancy's book is the back of a woman and this is the front of her book. I was like, what if it's the same lady?
I mean, as I've said before, I think that even though on the surface our stories are very different, there's a lot of similarities in terms of this idea of telling stories of women who are marginalized within the societies that they live within and who are in many ways, you know, entrapment is a daily reality of their lives. And so they are finding ways of escape either through friendship or love or even in, you know, moments of joy, whether that's television or eating at a Korean American restaurant in Los Angeles. So I feel like that is what is fascinating about both of our books, is that we have a face on one and then the back of a head on the other, and they are kind of mirroring each other in really interesting ways. So, yeah.
Yeah, and when I was reading about the single mother who was killed in Atlanta, and it just made me think of your book so much, Nancy. And I think it's just such a perfect companion piece to any news article that seems to kind of trivialize the lives of these women and take away their, you know, their depth and their stories. And so I've been recommending it often.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I think that this, our lives intersect with these women's lives in so many ways. For me, there is a very particular trauma of thinking about these women's lives and also the life of Mina Lee, who's the protagonist of my book, and how they are not only othered within mainstream society, but also othered within, you know, the Korean community, Korean American community, as women who, single women who are sort of isolated in various ways and live with a certain amount of shame about, maybe due to classism or sort of judgment about different professions that women have. And so this has really been a very difficult time, just kind of processing for all of us in different ways. In particular, thinking about how we spend a lot of time thinking about women who are victims once they are dead, as opposed to while they are alive. And in many ways, my novel, The Last Story of Mina Lee, is about it. It on the surface is an investigation of a death for a Korean American daughter, but it is really about an investigation of a life that wasn't known. And so, if anything, I hope that this is an opportunity for us to look at the lives around us that exist, the communities that these women existed in. These women shared dreams, hopes, you know, nightmares that you know, that kind of are that do not pass with a single person, but that exist kind of within our communities and our country at large. And so, yeah, this is just, I think, incredible. I mean, this is a tragic and terrible week, but also an opportunity to think about how we talk about life and what, you know, women who are working class women who are marginalized in so many ways, immigrant women, women of color, and that we do not center their stories enough, and how we treat so many women as disposable, as anonymous. And so I think both of our books are about, you know, kind of centering women who are considered at the fringes of society in so many ways. Yeah.
Something I really loved about both your novels, which, as Nancy mentioned, are very different in sort of substance, you know, and the stories and stuff, but something that I found very similar that was really striking about both of them. I'd actually read Frances's book for the first time last year, and then I reread it for this to prepare. And I thought both books did such a great job of casting no judgment on any character. And that I thought was really moving to read as the reader. And I think maybe even more so just during the pandemic, I've, you know, been home and I've sort of had lots of anxiety spirals where I sort of question myself and who I am, you know, and I think we've all gone through that. And to read a book that felt like it had no judgment on these characters and the choices they were making and making them feel very empowered and intentional about their choices was really, yeah, that was really moving, as like a piece of art, not to get all pretentious, but I really admired how you both pulled that off.
Thank you, Karen. I mean, it's been interesting to kind of see the feedback after people have read the book, because I think it does say a lot about, who's reading it and why they're having the reaction they're having, because it varies all over. So I've had responses ranging from, the room cutie, the room salon girl, and a lot of vitriol, kind of directed to her. Why can't she? Just failing to understand a lot of things about her. Or I've had people say, this is why Korean women don't marry Korean men. And I was like, it is. It's certainly not what I intended, but I think also what was in that particular reader's head, and things like that. So it's been so interesting to me, because when I was writing it, I was hoping to reserve judgment, exactly what you said. That was my aim. And it's interesting what judgments are passed by different people. And I do find that interesting. The Western view and the Asian view, Asians from Asia, it's a different response as well.
That's a really interesting. So one of the questions I'd want to ask, because it's really interesting that you sort of mentioned that your book is almost essentially like a I don't know how to pronounce this word, a Rorschach test, where whatever someone's thinking about, they're sort of projecting onto the book that they're reading. But I'm sure when you were writing it, you had very specific intentions of what you wanted the book's maybe effect to be, or sort of, I guess the better way to phrase it is, every time I read a book that I think is very good, it sort of lives with me in my brain after that. There's like a little part of it where I'll go about my life and something will remind me of that novel. What was the thing that you wanted to have live on in people's brains afterwards when you were writing the book? This question is for both of you.
Nancy?
That's a great question. I mean, I wanted to write a story that my intentions were to write a story that explored the complex interdependence between mothers and daughters and women, the ways that they need, love, and resent each other. And I also intended to write a story that, of course, centered marginalized women, immigrant women, women of color, working class women, that showed that they not only endure, and I think hardship is a part of our lives, but that they manage to create change and sort of create their own storylines. So that's the sort of answer to the question of what my intentions were. But in terms of what I really would love for people to walk away with is, I begin this novel with begin and end this novel. This novel is bookended with 2 phone calls, and we're not going to kind of do any spoilers there. But it is about a young Korean American woman who is attempting to sort of bridge various silences within her families, and is unable to, and is struggling through conversations with her mother, because they speak different languages, which exists in a lot of our families. Like, a lot of us speak a little bit of Korean or a little bit of English, that kind of mixed language environment exists in a lot of immigrant families. And so I hope that, this is an opportunity for people to think about the ways that they reach out and are unable to reach out to each other, the ways that they are able to sort of bridge some of those silences within their families, thinking about why we ask certain questions and why we don't, and what is lost kind of in that process of not asking these questions. Because for those of you who haven't read the book, Margot basically discovers her mother's body early on in the novel, and she realizes how little she knew about her Korean immigrant mother prior to her actual death. And so it is an excavation of not only the mother's death, but it's an excavation of her life. And it's also an excavation of her own self, trying to figure out who she is as a young Korean American woman. And so I hope that, this kind of creates interest in what are the things that we don't talk about in our families? Why don't we talk about those things? Why don't we make room for those conversations? What is lost when we don't have those conversations? So that's kind of what I hope is the takeaway.
I think that is, for me, that was a takeaway for sure. So congratulations, you crushed it.
So many people have, told me, like, I called my, I don't, there are some people have said, like, if anything, I called my mother more after reading this book, stuff like that, so thank you.
I mean, I really think, and Frances, I want to hear your answer too, but I really quickly wanted to say something that struck me about, especially the character of Mina in the book, is how it seemed like other people in her work environment were taking her for granted. Her daughter was sort of taking her for granted, but she was also taking herself for granted. And it made me step back and think, like, oh, I wonder if there's something conditioned, probably societally in all of us, especially as Asian women, to not only take other, women in similar positions for granted, but ourselves that way, and how hard it is to know that we're not valuing ourselves as much as we can. And without any spoilers, I think one of the incredible things that struck me was that, Mina is such a powerful and strong, enduring character with a level of perseverance that I like wish I could aspire to even. And it was so sad to see that, I don't know if the character knows this about herself. And, that made me think, like, I wonder if I have that. And I wonder if that's something that I'm not, aware of. And that was such a beautiful gift to have been given by that character. And now I'm crying about a fictional character.
Oh,
so very emotional.
We're going to cry so much. We've already cried so much, right? I mean, I think we've all cried so much this week. So I think, thank you so much for saying that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to say with Nancy's book, I thought it was so, it's almost hard to explain, but the Korean language itself makes it very difficult. And I was thinking a lot about it after reading your book is, it's hard to ask elders direct questions and receive direct answers in the Korean language. And the relationships and the dynamic is such that you just fall into the very everyday language of like, did you eat food? And then to go beyond that, and I think as writers, I'm sure, Nancy, you do the same, but I'm very always curious, and I make it a point in my life to go around to elders and ask really unusual questions in the Korean culture about their lives. And the immediate response is, why are you asking this? And then the answers are not direct. They're never direct. They're just like very, I call it cloudy. So you really have to pursue to get these answers. And I think that's why Mina and Margot have just such a divide. And it's hard to explain when you live in the same household and you have such a close relationship that's every single day. And I really understood that. And I'm curious if you receive questions about, but why is it like that? Or do people get it, do you think?
I think it's a mix. I mean, I'm surprised that I find that people who are from different cultural backgrounds will present that as part of their story as well. Like from all sorts of immigration stories and like, Latinx communities. I've had people say to me, I've had people ask me about this and say that it's something that exists in their family too, that there are stories that they have no idea how to kind of bring up within the everyday, struggle that we have to sort of just get by, which is, did you eat, like, did you eat enough? What did you eat today? Are you dressed warmly enough? The questions that our parents ask us. And so I feel like it's actually a pretty universal struggle, because I think that for whatever reason, we are, unequipped in everyday life to sort of deal with the realities of where we are emotionally and psychologically. And so we just kind of push things aside. I interestingly enough, as much as our parents don't like talking about these things and they question why we're asking these things. I remember when I was an undergrad and I took an Asian American Studies course, and one of the requirements was to do an oral history. And for whatever reason, my father, who never liked to, both of my parents were born in what is now North Korea, and they never liked to talk about the war, right? And for whatever reason, because it was an assignment for a college course, my father seemed very happy to be finally answering questions about what it was like during the war. And it was that framework of having this college paper that I had to work on that provided the safety for him to feel like now we can sit down and talk about, you know, what was it like? My father was separated from his mother and his siblings permanently, you know, during the war. And so he had never spoken about these things, but for whatever reason, the safety of the oral history, the safety of the Asian American Studies class allowed for this conversation to exist. And I hope that in some ways books and reading and writing is a way of artificially creating some of that safety as well. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That the act of actually reading a book or writing a book allows us to have a space where we can have conversations that aren't comfortable in any way in normal life. And so, you know, that's that kind of goes, you know, a lot of people are wondering about like what can we do in times like this? Everything's are so hard, you know, and then I saw Lisa Ko's great tweet about how, you know, diversity lists won't stop white supremacy, but you know what I mean? Like what can, like, you know, reading assignments or picking up books or whatever. But I do love this idea that books create a space for us to have conversations, at least with ourselves, about things that we are unable to talk about. And if anything, that provides the practice or a sort of sense of calmness that we can use to sort of create that space in real life. At least that's how I see it. Yeah. So, yeah.
That super makes sense. I feel like I feel very, and I know this is something that is maybe not as considered normal or as sort of in the majority of Asian families, I guess. My family's very open about talking, which is really nice. And my grandparents are also both from a province in what is now North Korea. And so I've asked them lots and lots of questions about it. And I've been living with them for this past year. And so that has been an extra amount of just time hearing about it. But I remember the first time I asked them about what it was about what life was like when they were younger is because I had read, as a kid, I read the book When My Name is Kyoko by Linda Sue Park, which was about a girl growing up in Korea during like the time when Japan was colonizing Korea and what that lifetime was like, and me realizing as a kid, like, oh my God, my grandparents were alive then, and asking my grandparents because I had this book to jump off of. And so, yeah, I love what you're saying of literature doesn't also, there is a thing to me that is kind of gross and about how sometimes it's literature by non-white people are often, you know, by writers of color are often given to white writers as like some sort of teaching moment, when really it's just like another, like a moment of humanity. Like it's just any other book, you know, it just shows these people living in these real moments. And I think as much as, you know, it maybe is helpful for white people to learn about Asian people that way, for Asian people, it's also just like, hey, here are some people and maybe, you know, you can see familiar faces in them. And that's really nice. But before we get further away, I want to talk about Frances's book too.
Well, that actually segues nicely because I mean, my motivation or kind of what I was thinking about when I was writing it is because I've never seen in English a book set in contemporary Korea. And I feel like people I would meet, I went to school in New Hampshire and even actually in New York, like there are, when you say Korea, the literature that if they have read, was largely historical fiction, or their knowledge of it wasn't the current events and the current issues that I think are very unique to Korea because of its recent history of rapid industrialization and all the extreme emphasis on academics and then all the escapist culture that's risen out of that. And in that escapist culture, I include, you know, K-pop fandom, which is very extreme, extreme gaming culture, which is why Korea has one of the highest internet addiction rates in the world, as well as the most advanced gaming cultures in the world. And I covered that for CNN because I was a culture and travel editor for years. And because of that, I wanted to highlight kind of the very modern issues that weren't seen before this, and that was my starting point.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. I'm curious, have you Has your book gotten, what has the reception in Korea been like? Have you been able to speak with readers who are here?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I love it because I think one review that I saw was the writer had said, "Well, it's very clear that English is not her first language, and it's was very much written in Korean and
Hmm.
translated." And I was like, "Oh, thanks." I actually like really really
Yeah.
appreciated that, uh, which which was interesting. And the reaction is, "Oh, why did you write about such non-ordinary things?" Actually, and
Hmm.
the reception from the West has been, "Oh my God, this is crazy stuff I've never heard of before. Is that true?" That's a question I get often. How much of this book is true? And I'm like, well, none of it's true because it's fiction. And it's based in truth, and the basis of it is 100% true. If anything, I would have toned down a lot of it because you can't have too much in fiction. Reality is often much more extreme than fiction.
Mhm. Yeah, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
I had a couple questions that I wanted to ask both of you. Oh, well, a question I really wanted to ask you both was that both novels were, for both of you, your first novels, which is really exciting. Congratulations. And I kind of wanted to ask, like, how long has this been a dream of yours? When did you first feel like, oh, maybe this is something I want to do? And then when did you realize, I'm doing this? Like, this is happening for me. Nancy, do you want to answer first, maybe?
Oh, sure. Thanks. Thanks for that question. I started writing very young. Probably, I remember doing silly little cartoons and things of that nature when I was, 5 or 6 years old. So I've always been kind of a casual writer on some level. And then in junior high, I remember writing really bad poems. I think that's how like some fiction writers start off, as like really bad poets sometimes. Do you know what I mean? Like really sentimental, dark, moody stuff. But it wasn't until I was in college and in undergrad, and I started taking courses in Asian American studies and Asian American literature, where I really actually began to imagine myself and a life for myself as a writer. And so that's why I think it's so important, obviously, that we're taking these courses, we're teaching these things, because I think until you see it and you see the hard work that people have done before you to make it possible for you to do that also, it makes it so much easier to imagine a future, I think, for yourself by looking at the past. You know what I mean? So I am super grateful for, I was an undergrad at UCLA, and I'm super grateful for the Asian American Studies Center there. And just being able to read and study with Asian American professors and imagining a life for myself, I think, is what created for me the first short story I wrote, which was as an undergrad. So, and then I've been working on, and then I shortly after that did an MFA, and I've been working on publishing a book in some form for at least 15 years. Mm-hmm. So I've been writing for a really long time. I graduated from my MFA in 2006. And so since then, I went through a ton of rejections. I went through like the full gauntlet of spending years with 100% rejection rates. And I'm talking about like 4 or 5 years where I was rejected from every residency, every fellowship, even the most local ones, like, can I write for 2 weeks in the back of your, Dairy Queen or whatever? Like, I've been rejected from
Dairy
them
Queen
all.
Said no.
No, this isn't on Dairy Queen, and I don't even know if there's a Dairy Queen where I live, but you know what I mean? Like, I've literally been rejected from all of them for years. So for me, it's been like a long struggle, just working, having so many other regular full-time jobs in the process. And then so that was my journey. Yeah.
That's amazing. I'm so glad that as readers, I feel like we're so blessed that you stuck through it. That must have been.
A lot of people will ask, like, how did that happen? You know what I mean? Like, what do you like? Because people want to know, like, the secret of, like, how do you get through all the rejections, or like, what do you? And for me, it was simply finding the story that only I felt like I can tell and that I needed to tell. And I think we all have that story, but it's a matter of like figuring out what that is, to the point of where you're working on a story that not only cannot let go of, but it cannot let go of you. And once you get to that point, I am a very undisciplined person. I don't count calories. I don't run. I'm not like a person with a lot of discipline. But once I found the thing that I needed to do, I suddenly became disciplined. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, I'm not like the person who like wakes up at 5 a.m. and does like a bunch of crunches or like, stuff like that. So, but I managed to find a story that I could wake up every day and be like, I need to get back to the story. I need to get back to it, So I feel like that was key for me. Yeah. What about you, Frances?
Yeah. I remember I was around 8 years old when I started to write my first book, and it was in English. And I just realized a few weeks ago that it was based off The Ordinary Princess. It's a children's book, and I was trying my own take on it. And I realized this because I got it from my daughter, and I was reading it to her, and I was like, okay, this is problematic. Never mind. And so many of the children's books these days, I keep doing that. I keep remembering an amazing book that I loved when I was young. I buy it and I start reading it, and I'm like, oh no, never mind. And I'm curious how my kids will grow up, because they will not have read any of the books I read, because I'm not letting them read it. They're reading all new books. But yeah, I started trying to write when I was 8, I remember. And that was always kind of absolutely my dream. And when I majored in creative writing and Asian studies in undergrad, and I went immediately to MFA as soon as I graduated. And after that, I took a full-time job at CNN. And actually, like, even all throughout school, I did newspaper and literary journal concurrently, and I think that really fed each other for me. I think the CNN job was kind of grueling in the sense that every single day you're churning out a lot of stories or assigning stories, and every day your editor is slashing your work, like very, you have to be brutally efficient and getting edited all the time. And in the meantime, so I would kind of escape from that into my fiction, where I would literally just write out words that I love, notebooks and notebooks of words that I like, and spend a lot of time on language, and instead of just communicating the crux of the matter in a way. And I think, yeah, it was really perfect training for me personally. And whenever you get sick of one, you go back to the other, and back you just keep swapping back and forth. But so I've been working on the book for about, first words on the page to publication was 10 years. And in between that, there were 2 full-time jobs. I was in Korea working full-time. And then about 6 or 7 years ago, we moved to New York. And that's when I was like, oh my God, I will do this. This will be my job. I will do my full-time job. Yeah. My husband got a job here. And I was like, okay, he's going to support me. And then I got pregnant right away. And for me, I think the final push was the desperation I had to get away from my children. So I was taking a second to leave them.
I love that.
My mom. And the only real excuse I had was, I have to write this book.
Yeah.
I would just go and try to find whatever corner. And my favorite spot was the basement laundry room in my apartment building, where there was no internet. There's a steady like hum of laundry, from like 15 different machines. And you just sit down, and it was actually very conducive. And I kind of wish I could go back there now, because I'm so, I need a place like that to escape.
Yeah.
I think we all do. I know.
Yeah.
I love that idea of like writing to escape the children.
Biggest motivation ever. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I think it was also like a very I was definitely going through a lot of postpartum depression as well, and that was my escape. Yeah.
That's amazing. A really lovely common thread in what both of you were saying, that's actually also true for me, is that we got to study Asian American history in college and Asian studies in college, which is really, I think, something at the time that again, another thing I took for granted, and now that I'm older, am really grateful for. And yeah, I really wanted to just quickly encourage, if there are any viewers who haven't studied that yet, I think regardless of your personal cultural background, it is incredible to learn. For me, as an Asian American woman, I remember feeling, pride in my identity, but then when I learned about it, there's something about learning about Asian people and looking at photos of Asian people in an American context, going back centuries and being like, oh, we've been here for a long time. It's not just sad moments in history. People like fell in love and had crushes and told jokes and loved each other. And it's so humanizing to see, and also at once very cold and factual, and it's really cool to feel rooted in facts in a way that before, I think it was just I always felt like I had to argue my way into being American or into being Asian American. And I was like, no, I've got all these facts to back me up about my existence. And yeah, so anybody who's maybe on the fence or interested, it's really empowering, and yeah, it's the best.
Yeah, it's kind of like a foundation on which you can build a house, and a house that's your own. Do you know what I mean? I feel like prior to taking Asian American studies, I grew up outside of LA's Koreatown, and there was always like these concepts of like, are you Korean enough? Are you this enough? Are you American enough? Are you, and there'd be so many voices about like who you should be, what you should look like, how you should, what sort of future you should model for yourself. But I feel like what Asian American studies did for me is it provided this alternative to kind of exist within, that I can invent myself in a lot of ways, and that is not any less Korean American than somebody who decides to choose an entirely different route. Do you know what I mean? So it kind of provided more of a spectrum of existence for me in some interesting way, where like I felt like we can kind of invent who we are based upon this history that we know exists, that's very rich and sort of important. And so it's incredible, like totally changed my life. And this is why we have to protect all of these departments, and Asian American studies, ethnic studies. Yeah,
I always find it interesting when I go to a bookstore and you look at all the biographies, children's biographies for children, and there are 3 like major series right now that you see them everywhere you go. And the only Asian biography I've seen is that of Bruce Lee. Each of the 3 series they've all covered Bruce Lee. And that's the only Asian that they think is interesting enough to cover. And that kind of floors me. And it's so interesting to contrast that. Of course, when I was growing up in Korea and Hong Kong, you go to bookstores and they have such a wide, obviously, because it's each country's canon of literature, and the fact that we are not in the States, you don't have that kind of access and any kind of names of famous Asians to be interested in is exceedingly problematic. And that's a big issue for me personally. And I think that's something that hopefully will change in the upcoming years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think there's something really hopeful and exciting for me, I think, is that there's so many, in a way that feels like a true change and not a trend. I feel like Hollywood is really changing in terms of what movies it wants to make, and different kinds of Asian movies, and not just movies about like rich Asian people or, like model minority Asian people. I think that is, and in my mind, I'm like, oh, if that's happening, people are going to also be more interested in stories of Asian Americans that were true. Like biopics are huge. And I remember thinking, like, weirdly, because, movies have proven to be commercially successful, there is now going to be hopefully more interest in that too, which has been nice. I think I'm seeing a bunch of questions come in. Do we want to do questions, or we can also, I can't remember if it was at 40 minutes or 45.
Well, I'm curious about your book too, Karen. Can you?
Oh,
Yeah.
I'll say I'm really excited about, I'm working on a book right now. It's a humor collection. Frances was the first person to email me because she saw my post go up on Publishers Marketplace before I did, and I saw it and I was like, oh my God, and I was so grateful. But an interesting thing about my book is, so it's a comedy book. It's a bunch of short, like, humor pieces. A few of them are a little bit longer. And something my agent and I noticed is when we were meeting with editors, my book proposal had nothing about personal essays and nothing about me talking about myself. It was like, I just want to write comedy. And obviously, because of who I am, a lot of the comedy will have to do with, maybe satirical things about being Asian American or what it's like to be a woman in society. But I made it pretty clear it wasn't going to be Karen Chee's life story. And I think there is a really unfortunate and frustrating thing that happens where if you are not a straight cis white man and you want to sell some sort of creative product, you are expected to sell a part of your identity. In a way that I was like, this is so annoying, because I have read humor collections by white men published much younger than when I got to publish mine, where they never had to explain themselves, they never had to talk about themselves. So that's been a constant sort of ongoing journey. And even as I'm writing it now, I've been getting some more like, like, why don't you write personal things in there? And I was like, well, I would be happy to. It's just, this isn't that book,
Right.
I don't have anything against personal essays. Anyway, that's sort of a thing that's been on my mind recently.
But,
yeah, well, hopefully when it comes out, it'll make people laugh. It'll just be fun.
Yay. Well, as you were saying about in film and television, wanting to see the full spectrum, I think also in writing and in humor writing, we need the full spectrum. I also, you know what I mean? So hopefully, this is all a part of that. And so,
I mean, that's the biggest pet peeve of mine, the fact that they, all, because growing up as an Asian in Asia, there's obviously a full spectrum of Asians in Asia.
Right.
And here, I was not familiar with what the stereotype of being an Asian in America was, because I was not good at math in my school. That kind of thing. I just had no idea when I came back, and I've had to learn it recently when we moved back. And I know that a lot of Asians don't like the recent crop of, the bling rich Asian stereotype as representing them, but I really welcome it, and because I think the more, you don't have to preface every Asian story with a certain sad story in a way, and like just welcoming all kinds of stories is the first step to just not being stereotyped.
Yeah. There's a thing that my friends and I talk about, which is that our dream is the moment we see the equivalent of a Mamma Mia 2 come out with an Asian cast is the moment we're like, we're done. This is we completely, you know what I mean? Because Mamma Mia 2 was a movie I loved, but was really unnecessary. Like, all the best songs were the first Mamma Mia. The second one was like, you're just redoing these songs without Meryl Streep. I was like, what is going on? But it was a movie I was like, I'm glad it exists. And
yes, exactly.
Once we get a movie like that too, it's going to be like, great. We get the whole spectrum, and that's
yes, exactly.
We should be allowed to do that. We should be allowed to have fun.
Yes, completely agree. Yes, we should be allowed to have fun. We should be allowed to have the serious Oscar contenders. We should be allowed to have all of that full, the docuseries, the whole spectrum of whether it's fluffy or mediocre or excellent. I mean, this is just humanity, that we're asking for.
100%. And there's also something really empowering, I think, about seeing, kind of like what Frances was saying, seeing Asian people just sort of existing without having to have a message of any kind. In the way that in Asia you just see people of all kinds. But like when I saw To All the Boys I've Loved Before, I remember being like, oh, she's just happy and awesome and in love and in high school. And like that was so empowering to see, where there was really no message in that movie other than maybe cast Lana Condor and everything. That was probably the moral of the story. But yeah, it was great. Oh man, okay, this is so fun. I think I'm seeing a bunch of questions come in, and since we only have 15 minutes, let's see if we can answer these. Okay, looks like some of these have gotten votes. So Oh my gosh, someone wrote in Korean. 오늘 너무 감사합니다. Oh yay, thank you for being here. They said, thank you so much for sharing your journey as a writer. And what do you do when you hit writer's block?
Nancy, what do you do?
I was going to say Francis. You're faster than me. You're faster than me. What do you do when you hit writer's block? This is a great question. I mean, I think there's no, I think that everybody has a different interpretation of what writer's block means, too, because sometimes writer's block is literally like, I have no words, or other times it means I'm not productively creating some, you know what I mean? So I'm not sure what writer's block gets interpreted a couple different ways, but I'm assuming that you're referring to just the inability to face a blank page and feeling like there's nothing to say, I guess. Is that our read here? So for me, if I am writing frequently enough, I rarely hit writer's block, but I also don't put a lot of pressure on myself when I write. Like, it's okay if it's crap. I expect the first couple of drafts to be really crappy. And so I think lowering the pressure definitely helps. A lot of times it just helps me to, if I'm overly fixated on one issue, like I'm having a plot issue and I'm like, what am I going to do next? I choose I'll choose minuscule things to sort of task myself with in order to divert my brain a little. And I'll find that I will end up solving that issue without even knowing it. So an example of that would be is sometimes I don't have the ability to write. I'm writing something really heavy and I just don't want to work on it. So I will spend 1 to 2 hours looking at adverbs, or I will spend 1 to 2 hours looking at the fact that I use the word like too much because I'm from Southern California. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So I reduce the task to very simple things where I could just do Control F and I'm like, so I'm working on it, but I'm not working on it. And I find that helps me deal with some of the larger issues at hand. And that's kind of that's even just life advice. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like sometimes when you feel crushed by this like pressure to create or pressure to do something, sometimes just picking minuscule things like, okay, I'm just going to go fold the laundry actually helps you kind of get to a better space where you can do larger things. So for me, it's like compartmentalizing in that way helps.
That is a really great answer. I also just want to say that there's a clarifying follow-up, which was when you get stuck, how do you unstuck yourself? Which I think is such a great way to ask that question. Yeah, that's a really great answer.
I'm stuck, so I hope someone can tell me
how to get unstuck.
Yeah, I think for me, it's always trying to what do you call it? What's the word? See, I can't even talk. Go go from one to another of incredibly inspiring things and then really terrible things. So what I mean by that is I read my people who I worship, I idolize, I read them and I feel such inspiration because it's so beautiful. And then I read something so terrible, I'm like, oh my God, everything is really bad. Okay, that's really, really bad. So, even I could write something equally bad or a little better than this. Kind of going back and forth between the two. I also find it very helpful to listen to masterclass. Do you guys have masterclass? So that is not in your discipline. So, St. Vincent, I watched that one recently on songwriting, and then Judd Apatow on comedy writing. Have you seen that one, Karen?
I haven't, but that's really interesting.
So I love doing that. And even when I was in my MFA, I would go take classes in the film department and the photography department and every department I could outside of my field. And those classes to me were the most helpful because you actually learn a lot about what you're struggling with, but you don't expect to. So photography in particular was wonderful in unsticking myself. Stuck.
That's amazing.
That's awesome.
You know what I mean if you actually listen to the lecture.
Yeah. When I get stuck, there are usually like 2 ways I can get out of it. And I think one for me is usually I'm stuck because of something that has happened in the writing process earlier on, like there's something that's a roadblock that's, not in that exact moment I'm stuck, but a bit sooner. And so it's nice to go back and sort of try and figure out what that is to sort of break free. And then the other way I get unstuck is usually kind of like what you're saying about like what is, if I have like a couple of different projects, I'll just go be like, great, my brain is fried on this one thing, I'm going to work on something else. And then at some point, I'll want to procrastinate on this other project and I'll come back to this one. And I feel like I'm most productive when I'm procrastinating on a different project. So it's nice to have a few irons in the fire at once. But yeah, I hope that answered your question. If you have another follow-up, please let us know. I'm gonna ask, okay, this one is interesting. It says, as a non-Asian, this is by someone named Jacqueline, I would like your perspective on lumping so many diverse cultures into one group called Asian. My immediate, or she probably wants to hear from you two, but I will say my immediate answer to that is I think there are so many categories that are sort of big umbrella categories for lots of different groups of people, like I identify as a woman, and I think there's so many different kinds of women. I also, identify as Asian. I think there's so many different kinds of Asian people. I think it's at once really lovely and sometimes flattening, terms like that. And I think if you're aware of the way that it's flattening, it can actually be very liberating. And I don't mean to speak in abstract terms, but I think because there are so many different cultures that go into being Asian and going into being, Asian American, it's really cool to be like, oh, we're reunited with all these different kinds of people and we all get to sort of be in this one big family. And at the same time, if we're cognizant of how different we are and how individual we are from each other, I think there's no harm in that. That's my take.
Yeah, definitely agree. Yeah. I mean, I think in some cases it's dangerous to lump, in terms of like when we think of like data aggregation, or like when you're looking at the fact that different Asian cultures have very different experiences and, relations. But in other contexts, it's actually very empowering to think of us as Asians or Asian Americans, because we have some overlap that kind of, creates like, strength and our ability to see what we have in common. But I definitely agree that in certain circumstances, it's dangerous to kind of lump us all together. And then in other circumstances, it can be quite empowering. So.
Yeah, I think as long as that term doesn't accidentally erase,
Yes.
certain people who might be caught in that term, as long as we're aware of that, and, hopefully using that term to be more aware of everybody in it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, because there's the danger that when we say Asian, we're talking about East Asian specifically or South Asian specifically, without realizing that there's so many different levels of like kind of the way power is experienced within each group and things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I used to have a game with my husband about how, like, trying to guess specifically how. I mean, I feel like I could look at someone and know if they're from Hong Kong versus China versus Korea, versus even if you're in Korea, you can tell, are they from Seoul or are they from Jibang, or, it's so you can be it's kind of crazy that it's all lumped together, but
Yeah.
it's only to non-Asians, I guess.
It is also funny to me that we get lumped together and then often just excluded. Like when I remember on election night and they were like, these are how all the different races are polling, and I was like, I guess we're other races. Like, awesome. Yeah. Okay, cool. Let's move on to the next question. Okay, I really appreciated your comment about how tricky it is for certain families to engage dialogue and that your college assignments about Korea can open a channel for them. I'm curious if you have read any Korean authors in English translation. This is by somebody named Kyung-soo Kim.
Yeah, I mean, I read Kim Ji-young in English, and I had read it when it first came out in Korean. And I was very interested to see that the tone of the translation, I was actually kind of, I felt going into it that there's no way they could have captured what it was like in Korean, because it was such an incredible, unusual experience. But the English translation did it so well. I was really how well it came across, and even without footnotes necessarily talking about different cultural things, because I think that's the biggest thing. When I was writing about Korea in English, I would have to grapple constantly about how to contextualize a certain concept or a word.
Mhm.
But if you're translating, there's no contextualizing, because you assume that the reader is Korean.
Mhm.
And yeah, it was absolutely brilliant. I love Hangang too. I
Mhm.
read
Yeah.
them both. I thought the translation was excellent. I mean, but I do love contemporary Korean writers. I try to read as many as I can in Korean when I go, the latest batch. And my personal favorite is Chang Gang-myung-shi.
Mhm.
I don't know if he's translated into English, but yeah, highly recommend.
That's so exciting. I read Kim Jong in the other direction. I read it in English first and then in Korean. And I remember
Wow.
when I was reading it in English, I read it because my friend who doesn't speak Korean recommended it to me first. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I was like, there are so many things in here, and I can't remember the details anymore, but it almost felt like a word by word translation, where I was like, oh, I bet I know what they're saying, but it does feel a little bit weird in English, at moments. And then when I read it in Korean, I was like, oh, okay, cool. Like, that was correct, which is very fun to see, and also really gratifying almost to be like, oh, even though so much of that Korean sort of the staccato of that language was preserved into English, it was still, people got it and people loved it, which was fun. I recently, a couple months ago, I read The Disaster Tourist, which I also thought was
Oh.
so good.
Oh, cool. I haven't read that
yeah.
one. Yeah.
Oh, it was also really jarring. It like scared me a lot, where I was like, I bet this is happening. Like, I bet this is a real thing. So that freaked me out. But yeah, Nancy, did you want to answer also?
Yeah, I feel like I have just discovered, Korean literature in translation in the past few years. So definitely The Vegetarian, Human Acts, those books are haunting, and they sort of stick with me. And I am always taking book recommendations, so I love this. A lot of my familiarity has been more with Korean American authors, and so I'm used to reading things that are originally written in English. And I myself am not fluent in Korean, so I'm not able to read things directly in Korean. But I love that there is such an influx of Korean books being translated into English right now. And I feel like I'm learning so much about Korea in such an interesting way. And I mean, even Frances, your book, it was written in English, but I feel like I learned so much about contemporary Korea from it. And so I'm just so grateful to have that connection. And I feel like I understand my cousins a little better now. And yeah, and it just, so this is just a really exciting time for our books. I'm just so grateful. So many options now. Now there's almost too much to read, right? It's like...
It's great. Also, Nancy, I love what you were saying, because I think there are so many Korean American authors writing stories that, are in English in a way that, and I can't remember who, but this was like, I was reading about this recently, about how being Asian American is like its own identity that's, and in our case, specifically being Korean American is different from being Korean and different from being whatever people consider mainstream white American. And reading Korean American authors like Alexander Chee or Aro Kwan or Nicole Chung makes me feel like, this is a cool identity we get to have, and this is who we are. And I'm like really fascinated by Korean literature, but it does feel like one step removed from me in a way that reading these books by Korean American authors is so grounding and so liberating at the same time, which is very cool. Yeah. Okay. So a bunch of people. Liza or Lisa Cohn asks, Frances, do you consider writing in Korean? This is just for you.
I mean, it's in my... I have this secret desire to try writing something in Korean. Yes, for sure. But I think because the last 7 years of my life, I'm mostly here. English is easier to write in, for sure. But never say never.
Okay, there's also a question by someone named Trina that says, where is your major market, Korea, the US, or elsewhere? I like that question. I'm going to sort of adapt it a little bit and say, this is maybe our last question, is who in your mind is your dream reader? And who is in your mind is like your target audience? Yeah.
Francis?
Okay.
You go first. Yeah, I know. I mean, when I was writing my book, I imagined my dream reader was a woman like the main character, Margot, who's a 26-year-old Korean American woman who was trying to figure out the story of her mother's life, as well as the story of her own life as it is happening. And so I always kind of imagined as I was writing, because I have social anxiety, so I can't imagine like huge audience or anything like that. I imagined one or two people, and that was in the case of my book, a Korean American woman who, is trying to figure out the stories around her and the stories that she wants to tell and the stories she wants to live. And so, wanting to look for stories that, I don't think we're used to seeing ourselves in stories in such complex ways, and so I'm kind of writing the book that maybe I needed when I was 26 years old. And I hope that my book is not translated into Korean, so I hope that one day it will be, and that my mother could read my novel, because she doesn't read English.
Ask if your mom has read your book.
No, she hasn't, and I think that's it's kind of heartbreaking, right? Like, it's like, because the book is so much about translation and about silence and about finding common languages between people. And so I hope that, mothers and like the daughters of mothers like my mother, who was also a single mom and an immigrant working class, like I hope that, I imagine them as an audience for this book, and I hope they can relate to aspects of it.
I love that. I love that so much.
Now, when I saw this page, it really made my jaw drop to the floor, where you mix the Korean in with the English. I've never seen that before, and I was like, "Oh my god, I can do that!" Like, in some, maybe I'll self-publish one day, but like, I would love to do a book where it's like that. Like, you have the perfect mix of Korean language and English language, but.
That was also really striking, because earlier in the book, there are lots of moments where people are speaking in Korean, but you write them in English. So when that moment leapt out, I was like, that's her grandma. Like, it was such an added layer of like, that is Korean in her bones. Like, that's a Korean person she knows who is speaking to her. That was incredible.
Oh my gosh, I'm so touched. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think as a Korean American kid, we struggle with so many issues of not feeling adequate enough, not feeling good enough, not feeling enough, both within American society and not feeling enough within our families. You know what I mean? So for myself, with that struggle to sort of have the language to speak to my mother, I think in the end, I wanted to make a gesture of an offering. Margot was offering herself in that moment. I might not know a lot of Korean, but this is how, sorry, I want to start crying. This is what I can give you, and I hope that you can understand me. So, yeah.
Oh my God.
Sorry, guys. I think we all cried at least once, but, yeah. Thank you.
Not read my book but she has no intention of reading my book, I think. I think she thinks it might be bad, so she wants to protect herself from having to tell me that my book is bad. Like extremely direct that way, the way that I think a lot of Asian moms can be, like very harsh truths told with love. And so, I'm like, so Mom, you haven't read my book yet? She's like, no, like, no intention. But I did love so much of this and this talk, and oh my gosh, this is such a cool event for me, and I wish I could keep talking to you guys forever.
Oh, I am so grateful for both of you, and I am sure all of our families and our ancestors are proud of us, whether or not they are able to read our books.
Yes, that's true.
They are proud of us. So yeah,
I'm really proud to know both of you, and I truly from the bottom of my heart loved both of your novels. If people who are watching have not purchased them, I hope you buy them or borrow them from the library. They're really excellent, and they'll make your heart feel like it is glowing. So I think we're supposed to wrap up because our time is over. This was so lovely to get to talk with both of you. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. Thank you to the Montclair Literary Festival and everyone who organized it.
Thank you. I love this talk. I could have all day. It was amazing. So thank you. Thank you so much for being here today. It was a real pleasure. And a reminder to everyone to please buy the author's books. You can click on the green button at the bottom of your screen. And we want to thank our festival sponsors, event partners, festival friends, staff, everyone who's helped us. We still have some great events coming up today and tomorrow. The next event is a talk tonight at 7 p.m. with Don Lemon from CNN and Jooyoun Reed. Sure to be fascinating. You can still purchase tickets. Take a look on our Crowdcast channel to sign up. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.